Hi, Molly.
How are you doing, Amy?
I am well this morning. Was up with a sick kid last night, so I may be a little inarticulate this morning, but we rally. That's what working mamas do.
Yeah, I want to give you good. This is your infant child, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have a 2.5-year-old that still struggles with sleeping, so I just wanted to give you those words of encouragement.
Encouragement, right?
Better.
It gets better in like 10 years. Yeah. Maybe that's the video that should go out for moms, new moms. So anyway, we are here not to talk about the struggles of working parenthood, but about religion and politics. And there has been plenty in the news. I'm Amy Sullivan, and I'm a former writer and editor at Time magazine. And I'm here with
Mollie Ziegler Hemingway. I write about religion and politics at getreligion.org and ricochet.com.
And first up for us to talk about is the little Komen Foundation Planned Parenthood showdown that took place last week. I actually suspect that you and I are going to be closer in opinion on some of the things we're talking about this week than we usually are. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this, but I just came away from this episode not feeling good about anything. And in fact, really not looking forward to the next race for the cure when it becomes a political decision whether people sign up for the race or not, or whether they wear pink ribbons or not. It's just kind of been disappointing all around.
Yeah, it was a disappointing week or a few days of news there. I think one of the things that really bothered me the most actually was not the outcry from activists who care more about Planned Parenthood than Komen, or that senators got involved, or that companies threatened to pull their funding of Komen, or anything like that. I really did not like the media coverage. It was just not even pretending to be anything other than just 100% on the side of Planned Parenthood. Mm-hmm. And it made me feel really frustrated because I'm a pro-life woman, and it was like we didn't exist. They kept referring to this as like, well, women are upset with Komen, and women support Planned Parenthood, and women's health is all about Planned Parenthood. And I'm someone who, I made my very first donation to Komen last week when they announced the policy change. I have a friend who did all 14 3-day walks last year, and I'd wanted to support him all last year, and I was unable to because I couldn't, in good conscience, give money to Komen while it was funneling money to Planned Parenthood. So I made my contribution, and then I watched this news coverage completely pretending like people like me don't exist, not mentioning our views, not mentioning the fact that there are many of us who did not feel we could in good conscience fund Komen over the years while it was such a popular charity. Because of this, we were just completely ignored. It's like we didn't exist, and it made me very frustrated. It made me feel really depressed, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you're definitely right about the one-sidedness. And I am actually a Planned Parenthood supporter, but it was still frustrating to me as I saw my Facebook timeline filling up with posts from people because it seemed that it was less actually Planned Parenthood supporters that were being galvanized. And in fact, I have a piece at Time about this week, because it was much more interest and energy than we saw last year when a number of states passed laws defunding Planned Parenthood, or saying that their state money would not go to Planned Parenthood clinics. And when Congress actually considered this at the federal level and practically shut down the federal government last year, I didn't see anything on Facebook about that. But this was much more about Komen. It was much more about breast cancer and women who felt like they had been betrayed by Komen.
It was really interesting that there have been so many sort of incremental gains in questioning the, $450 million in taxpayer funds that go to Planned Parenthood each year. There have been states that have decided not to fund Planned Parenthood. There have been attempts at the federal level to limit funding or take away funding. And you haven't seen that type of outcry. And in fact, a lot of people, seem to be supportive of these efforts. So I think part of what you were seeing with this Komen backlash was an opportunity to, completely to take all that frustration that pro-choice activists have had over the years and funnel it into this one moment. But I'm frustrated. It's totally reasonable that Planned Parenthood would come up with a PR campaign that says if you take away $600,000 in funding a year from Planned Parenthood, all of a sudden you're becoming political. Yeah. But there were many of us who didn't like that political engagement to begin with. We wanted to fight breast cancer. We wanted to fund cancer screenings. We didn't want it to go to a $1 billion organization that performs 330,000 abortions a year. Compared to 6,600 mammogram referrals, not even mammograms, but just referrals. I mean, there are plenty of health organizations out there that serve, needy populations, marginalized populations. There are in fact probably 10 times as many. What are they called? Like federally qualified health centers that are not Planned Parenthood that these funds could have been going to, that actually also probably serve a much better population in that breast cancer is not typically a disease that affects the younger population served by Planned Parenthood. It is a disease that typically, hurts women of middle age or older age. And so it wasn't even, it made total sense to not lose out on contributions from people like me and target the funds better. I'm not, in fact, defending the way Komen handled this, because obviously this is a PR debacle for the ages. But it's still just frustrating the way the media didn't cover this in any way fairly. It
is. I think it was frustrating all around. The charge that, Komen shouldn't have been giving money to them in the first place because they just do referrals. A lot of Komen grant recipients handled this in terms of giving referrals because, right. I go to my OBGYN, they don't do mammograms right there. They're going to refer me to a clinic where I can have the procedure done. I just felt there was a lot of posturing and capitalizing on the episode by fundraising.
So what do you think is going to be the long-term fallout of it? Obviously in the short term, this was an unmitigated disaster for Komen, a huge victory for Planned Parenthood. But do you think in the long run it's going to destroy Komen, or what's going to happen?
I think in the long run, Komen's brand has definitely taken a hit. There are people who pointed out last week, rightly, that Komen has had some problems that maybe haven't gotten much attention over the last few years in terms of, suing other organizations that use For the Cure as, one of their mottos. Maybe how they spend their money on high salaries and... there have just been a lot of questions about Komen, and I think this is.
I just want to point out again, these things have been there for how many years? And so long as Komen was funding the abortion industry, or a company or an organization that does all these abortions, nobody was looking into any of this. You go against Planned Parenthood and you will be destroyed. Obviously Planned Parenthood figures have huge salaries.
Well, there was actually a whole documentary on Komen, and I'm forgetting the name of it at the moment.
Right.
But it came out a couple of years ago. So people have been looking into this.
I know, but Andrea Mitchell, when Andrea Mitchell was marching with Komen and praising Komen, and when they were working with Planned Parenthood, that was great. And I'm not sure if you saw the Andrea Mitchell monologue against... Oh, yeah, you did, because you mentioned it in your timepiece. When she was monologuing against Nancy Brinker, it was... I'm sure it felt very cathartic for her to defend big abortion and all that. But it was embarrassing as a journalist. And then, not like the next day, she interviews Barbara Boxer, who goes off saying stuff like, and it's a fact that right-wingers don't believe that women should have good health care. And she doesn't interrupt her. She doesn't do anything. And she, in fact, thanks Barbara Boxer for her work defending Planned Parenthood. It's just the double standards are frustrating. It's infuriating. And it's embarrassing as a journalist. It's just, I understand that people have strong feelings about abortion. I certainly have strong feelings about abortion. But everyone needs to remember that people deserve fair coverage. If you're gonna go after one side, you got to go after the other too. Equally, you have to check your biases. You have to think about what you're not seeing because of your personal views, and redouble your efforts to make sure you're questioning assumptions and all that. And that just didn't happen this week.
No, you're right. This, we agree on that the media coverage was very one-sided on this. And I just want to propose, before we move on to the next topic, although this could get us going, that obviously you and I have very different opinions on Planned Parenthood, but one of the things that struck me, and not for the first time this week, was Planned Parenthood, was in the position of losing $600,000 in grants from Komen. And within 4 days, because of the backlash against the decision, they managed to raise $3 million. Even if Komen has kind of changed their policies back again, Planned Parenthood can basically cover the breast cancer detection and education work that they've been doing for the next 5 years.
Right. Although, that's another point, though. But who's going to start funding Planned Parenthood with these new, terms of agreement? Once you're in, you can never check out. It's the Hotel California of fundraising, as I read someone say on Twitter. You will have to give more and better.
Okay, Molly, but that's what I was getting us away from here. There was a really interesting Slate piece, and I'll try to find it so we can link to it in this discussion, a couple of years ago, that was written by a pro-choicer, but who was proposing that large abortion rights groups like Planned Parenthood move to a donation-only model as a way of just taking this issue out of the political realm. No matter what side you are on of the abortion issue, so many of us are just tired of these fights about the funding. And there are a lot of pro-choice women out there and pro-choice men who could provide the funding that supports a group like Planned Parenthood. And, when I first read it, I didn't know how comfortable I was with the precedent of just taking this completely out of the public-private realm and putting it completely into private donations. But the more I thought about it, the more I actually really liked that proposal.
Well, as a libertarian, you will get no fight for me on that. I wish that would be the case for how we handle all these things. And I do think that would depoliticize it much more if people were just making voluntary contributions and not being forced or blacklisted and all these other things that are very frustrating. And it's also sad because, it'd be nice if we had more unifying causes that didn't get embroiled in some of the more polarizing causes out there. And so... yeah, sounds good. Great. I'm glad you solved the whole problem of the last week.
Check. Okay, move on to the next issue, which also has been driving me crazy and just, I think, getting worse and worse and worse ever since they announced it, which was the Obama administration's decision to go with a very narrow definition of religious employer in their mandate under health reform, which requires employers to cover contraception in health plans. And I should say here that as someone who has paid, I can't even add up now how many hundreds or thousands of dollars for birth control over my life, I am thrilled by this part of health reform that will make this free for women. However, I'll let you maybe describe what the problem has been for religious groups, and then we'll go into some of the politics of this.
Right. So HHS came out with this rule, and normally when, there are states that have come up with laws requiring all organizations and companies to fund sterilization fund various things. But HHS came up with a dramatically more narrow exemption, or no exemption, really, saying that, whether you're a Catholic charity or some other religious group that has opposition to contraception, sterilization, or abortifacients, you will be required to cover these in your health insurance plans that you offer to your employees, or you will pay a fine, a heavy fine. And so this puts Catholics, mostly Catholics, although there are other groups that also would fare poorly here, in this untenable position of having to choose whether to stop serving the poor, stop serving the groups that they wanted to serve by starting their charity, their hospital, their college, whatever it is, or pay a heavy fine. And these are very difficult choices. And so even though it affects mostly Catholics, and not even all Catholics, but some Catholic institutions, you're seeing widespread religious support for this. My church body just came out last week saying, and we're Lutheran, we stand with Catholics. That doesn't happen very often. The Orthodox bishops, who never get politically involved, they all came out and said that they stand with the Catholics. You're seeing people who have no problem with birth control coming out. Although it's also true that there are religious groups on the other side of the aisle that are saying that they think that the exemption is fine. Really, it's a question.
Because I haven't seen any. Even the National Council of Churches has refused to come out and support
there's
this.
the, what is it called, like the Religious Coalition for Choice or something?
Yeah, they don't really count. I mean, Catholics for Choice, those groups for choice, seriously. Because this is not an abortion issue.
Yeah, yeah, and I should know more about specifically what they said, but I thought that they were coming out in favor of the mandate. So it's not totally unified, but you're seeing some odd bedfellows. Even USA Today had been running editorials against op-eds against the HHS mandate, but they actually ran an in-house editorial also saying that it violates religious freedom.
Yeah,
and so you're seeing that there's sort of some lines being drawn here, and it'll be, I mean, I'm very curious to see whether people care about it, because even though contraception is less controversial in the general population, I mean, many people use it or support it even on religious grounds, and even many Catholics use it or support it. You're seeing even Catholics who use it and support it saying they think that this is a bridge too far and that the Obama administration shouldn't tell Catholic bishops or tell Catholics how to run their charities or violate their conscience. So, but I'm kind of curious if it's gonna resonate on a larger scale or not. I really don't know.
I think it absolutely is, because it is not. The issue is not about contraception, and that's what I keep hearing from the White House is, well, 90% of Catholic women use birth control. That is not what we're talking about here. It is an issue of religious freedom. And even more than that, it's an issue of the White House throwing the very people who made health reform possible. Sister Carol Kean and the Catholic Health Association. These are the Catholic hospitals who came out and said, healthcare reform is not going to be a bad thing. It's something that we've been working on. We watched this. They made it possible for health reform to happen. And then when this rule came up, they spoke out very quickly and said, this will only be okay if you broaden the definition of religious employer to include us. And the White House just threw them under the bus. And now they're in the position of having to turn around and say, well, we have to oppose health reform if it includes this mandate with this narrow definition. And it's appalling to me, because there were several things in the rollout of this decision that I thought were just so incredibly tone deaf. One was releasing it the weekend of the Roe v. Wade anniversary, which again is putting abortion framing around a decision that has nothing to do with abortion. It is substantively about contraception, but again, this is a religious freedom issue. And the second thing was saying, okay, well, we're not going to broaden the definition as religious groups have been lobbying us to do, but we're going to give them an extra year. An extra year for what? To decide that their religious principles don't matter to them?
Right. Well, it's only like 2,000 years of Catholic teaching. I'm sure another year they'll totally reverse course on what they're under pressure. I'm sure. No, I'm kidding. But it was tone deaf. It's certainly interesting to watch how the liberal Catholics who worked so hard on healthcare seem to be far more outraged than even the conservative ones who might have been more reticent about the healthcare reform. And it is, there's a sense of betrayal that you're reading when people talk about these things. I'm also reminded of how, earlier on in the Obama presidency, there was this right-wing talking point about how President Obama, we were led to believe that he doesn't believe in freedom of religion. He only believes in freedom of worship. And there were all these things coming out saying, well, notice when he talks about religious freedom, he only says freedom of worship. And that's because this is a change and nobody's ever done this before. And there was this great religion editor down in Arkansas who, and it's Frank Lockwood at the Bible Belt Blogger is his blog. And he showed how actually presidents throughout the ages have referred interchangeably to religious freedom and freedom of worship. I thought it was a really great piece. It's also interesting now that you are seeing some division here between this idea of religious freedom and freedom of worship. I think Obama is very strong on freedom of worship. You're seeing less strength on freedom of religion, the sort of broader understanding of whether the state can tell religious people or institutions what they can or can't do. The Obama administration lost badly in that Hosanna Tabor versus the EEOC case, the Supreme Court ruling on what's called the ministerial exemption, whether you can be exempted from federal hiring and firing regulations if you're a religious institution. And they argued that there should be no ministerial exemption. Now, that was totally renounced by every single member of the Supreme Court. It was a 9-0 decision against what the Justice Department was arguing. But it does show you kind of the thinking behind that Justice Department. And there's certainly a different conception of what religious freedom means emanating from there than what we may have been used to previously. But do you think they'll backtrack on this, or do you think what's going to be the solution?
I can't tell you how depressed I am about this, just having written for 10 years now about Democrats and religion and how really narrow-minded they've been in their thinking about religious voters and religious issues, and seeing it get better over the last few years, and then watching this year just a complete meltdown of understanding. I don't want us to move on without taking the Bishops' Conference to task here, because I do think that the USCCB has basically declared war on Obama. They say that he's declared war on religious freedom. But if we're going to fairly call out what is going on here, there's a two-sided war going on. It's a fairly hot war, and it's not a coincidence that it's heating up in an election year. That said, I think the administration and a bunch of professional Democrats in campaigns has made an enormous mistake in really focusing its ire on the Catholic bishops. When you hear them talk and when you listen to the news that came out of choice groups after the decision was announced, it was all, Obama stood up to the pressure from the bishops. Well, as you point out, the pressure has been coming from liberal and progressive Catholics. E.J. Dionne was one of the first out of the gate to write a disappointed column about all this. Melinda Henneberger has been on the Post page every day, practically, writing about what a mistake she thinks this is. All sorts of Catholic academics and theologians have been speaking out and pressuring the White House publicly and privately, and they should know better than to think that this was just a matter of the bishops asking for something, and they know they consider the bishops to be political opponents, so, we're going to stick it to them. It was just such a stupid way to go about it, but I'm afraid that that's the frame they have, and what they're missing is that you've got lots and lots of Catholics who aren't necessarily going to vote against Obama because of one decision by the HHS. But they are going to vote against him if they get the sense that he is in some way, for real or not, opposed to the Catholic Church in general.
I wonder if you can explain a little bit more about what you mean by the bishops going to war against Obama.
Sure. Well, after not only this HHS interim rule was announced, but also there were a few brouhahas this fall, one including HHS's decision not to re-up a grant to a group that works a group that works through the Bishops' Conference. And actually, there are some interesting parallels with the Komen decision, because according to the grant requirements, this
you have to support abortion.
Group didn't
get people to their abortions.
I'm sorry?
You have to get people to their abortions, or you're not eligible for funding, basically, is what the Obama administration said.
Well, no, it was more access to birth control. There were certain requirements for grant recipients, and they decided not to give it to this group. Now, I think there probably was a bit of, again, the political, we want to stick it to the bishops, which is immature and stupid, but it was completely within their rights to decide not to do this. However,
it's also worth noting that the group that is no longer eligible for funding by any metric was the most efficient and best at handling the sex trafficking cases. So,
and it's also worth noting that they do, in fact, help clients obtain access to birth control and sometimes obtain access to abortion. But that's not something that the Bishops' Conference would want to admit in their application for the grant. So, on the face of it, they're not actually living up to all the standards that grant recipients would want to have. But be that as may, we're talking about the bishops declaring war. And basically, this was in the annual meeting that took place in November. The bishops talked about no other policy issue other than the threat to religious freedom, which was not, it was not defined as a threat coming from lots of quarters. It was a threat coming from the White House. And again, I think it was not a coincidence that it was leading into an election year, a year out from an election. And this has been something that the Obama administration just kind of walked into with this latest decision. But the bishops were gearing up for a fight, and they lucked out because Obama gave them more ammunition. But, it's just an unusual case for this White House that they have a group like the Bishops' Conference, which is both a recipient of a lot of money, so it's a social service provider that they work with, but also a political opponent. I can't think of any other group that really serves those two functions.
I would just like to point out, again, I have to bring in my libertarian perspective, that if these religious charities didn't get so in bed with the government, and I realize that was a two-way street, that the government wanted to co-opt what was going well with these religious charities, but the religious charities also wanted all this money from the government. Right. And now they realize once they're in bed that there are all these strings attached. And if these groups, and I say the same thing about Lutheran Social Services and other charities that are affiliated with Lutheran churches, we wouldn't be having these problems. And it's a great argument for private funding of really good charities. But I did want to also point out that while the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is currently led by, someone who would sort of be more on the right, and a lot of the rhetorical strength might be for more traditional positions and whatnot, there's actually quite a bit of dissent among the bishops, and they might, officially vote one way or another, but there are quite a few liberal bishops, part of this conference as well. And what's interesting about this HHS rule is how personally almost every single one of them has spoken out against it. I haven't checked in 5 days or so, but over 80% of bishops had personally addressed their constituents, sometimes having letters read during Mass last Sunday, not this most recent Sunday, but
the previous one.
A week prior. Yeah, most Catholics were actually read letters from their bishop about this threat to religious freedom. And I just also want to point out, since I can't let this media thing go, that this was almost completely not covered in the immediate days afterward by any national media. There were a few, but like nothing on the nightly news about this. It's just so interesting how your perception of what's big news is shaped by story selection, and none of the networks even mentioned that Catholic bishops were so unified in this, or that there was this growing groundswell of opposition. And,
I think that will change. I think this is not going away, and
in fact, I think you're seeing it right now. You're seeing a lot more coverage right now. But
yeah.
Okay.
Oh well, I'm tired of being depressed by that.
Okay. Well, you recently wrote a piece on compassionate conservatism, the sad state of compassionate conservatism. Can you tell us a little bit about what you argued in that piece?
Sure. Well, I was just struck watching far too many debates so far this year, and please, Lord, let them be over for the primary season. In the difference in rhetoric, and maybe it's brought on by the sheer number of debates, but the difference between what we heard in 2000 with George Bush very consciously branding himself as a compassionate conservative, but talking about what that philosophy meant to him. What we saw in 2008 with Mike Huckabee, who used to talk about how he was a conservative, but he wasn't angry about it, and who was willing to take some stands that would get you just lambasted this year. And then this current crop of candidates, and the maybe one-upsmanship that takes place in these debates, trying to play for the audience. We've seen debates in which the audience boos the golden rule when Ron Paul cites the golden rule, when they cheer Rick Perry for saying that he's presided over the most executions of any state and any governor. There's just been a meanness that I've been struck with because it doesn't fit the compassionate conservative mold. And I guess I've wondered, even as a lot of conservatives and religious conservatives have gotten more involved privately in what we might term compassionate conservatism, getting involved in causes that fight sex trafficking, or the Catholic Bishops' Conference supporting broad immigration reform. It seems like at a political level, it's not viable to be a compassionate conservative anymore.
I don't know. I mean, definitely the term is dead, and thank God. That was a really offensive term, actually, for quite a few conservatives because of the implication that George Bush lovingly bestowed on all conservatives that they weren't compassionate. I mean, it's frankly a real dickish term, particularly when you're running supposedly from the right. And I think that you can look at the policies of George W. Bush and see that his, compassionate conservatism didn't really work out so well. Maybe with an exception. I mean, I'm very much for a small government in terms of size and scope, but with the exemption of, the Africa funding for AIDS initiatives, I don't think his ideas are very popular among left or right. But I think
the Africa initiative was no small chunk of change. It was $15 billion for Africa, which has ended up being, by all measures, quite a success in terms of what they've been able to achieve.
Right. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. In that, I mean, even take Gingrich's position on immigration. I mean, it seems very much he seems to have a very sort of compassionate approach to immigration in terms of not wanting to deport people who have been living here for a long time or whatnot. Although he was also, I think, he was not criticized for it. It was really weird how Rick Perry had a similar view and was roundly criticized in the debates. I mean, he was booed, I think.
I think Michelle Bachmann immediately criticized Gingrich for what that was what he said was humane immigration. Okay. And I agree that is in relative terms slightly more humane, but we've really lowered the bar when it's a compassionate policy stance to not want to ship 80-year-olds back to the home country.
Well, I mean, it's also this is kind of my whole beef with the terminology, though, is that we tend to think that if you just come up with a big government solution to something, a big government plan for something, and it sounds very compassionate, like you're going to help the poor, you're going to help the marginalized, you're going to help the immigrants. Nobody ever asks for results. I mean, we've been trying out all these huge government programs for how many decades? The war on poverty has been waged for a long time, and it's not winning. We've got all these sort of almost like prisons for people in the welfare system. Not literal prisons, but it's hard to escape the welfare system. It's hard to get out of. Once you sort of get into that place, it's hard to get out of it. It's hard to. It's a very dangerous and bad situation. We're not actually helping the poor, but so long as we sort of accept these cliches that a big government program is compassionate and it helps the poor, nobody ever asks like, well then why is that housing complex such a disaster over there?
Right.
Nobody ever seems
that's
to
not
care
quite
about
fair,
that.
though, because something like food stamps is not intended to have a permanent result. It's intended to help people, including the many, many new unemployed in the U.S. right now,
but
afford groceries for their families. And it is, but now it's become kind of an epithet that, Gingrich throws out there, that Obama's the food stamp president.
Right.
And, if you've ever been on food stamps, which Gingrich has not, you know that it's a whopping, $1.25 a day for food. This is not exactly people getting rich off of the government.
Well, and it's, again, though, people say like, so therefore Obama is compassionate or President Bush is compassionate because we saw such huge increases in food stamps. But there's a whole sector of the population that would say it's much more compassionate to have a healthy economy that actually gets people jobs.
Okay, and that's the metric
that's what I'm saying.
too.
Why is one thing compassionate and the other
Republicans
thing
in Congress
not?
who have been opposing jobs plans. I mean, it seems like some of that rhetoric is really crying crocodile tears.
I guess what I would like is if people recognize that everybody wants to fight poverty, everybody wants to help improve the economic situation, the job situation. There are just competing ideas about how it's best to do that.
Okay.
And when we demonize our opponent and say, well, they were against that jobs plan, or they like food stamps, it belittles the whole argument. Everybody wants to help the poor. Presumably, the vast majority of people want to help the poor. They're just competing arguments for which is the best way to go about doing that.
Okay, but that was part of my argument as well, is that that used to be the case. It used to be that people at least felt the need to say, well, of course we want to help the poor. And this is what I hear from people, lay people all the time outside of politics, and I think it's very true. But what has changed, I think, is you don't hear that so much at least on the Republican side. You heard, Herman Cain, who I'm not going to take as the, standard bearer for the Republican Party, but just saying, if people want a job, they should just get out there and get a job. There's been a meanness in the way people talk about the poor and talk about them as if, they don't deserve our help.
To be fair, Gingrich was saying that. I mean, he was saying that it's much better to help the poor through job creation than food stamps. I don't know if we really need to. You're making me feel very uncomfortable having to defend this current slate of Republican presidential candidates. But I mean, these arguments were more nuanced than you see in the sound bites, and even in the same debates where Gingrich was lambasting the food stamp issue, he was definitely talking about job creation and the importance of a healthy economy and helping people see that a lifetime of work is honorable. And
it's
these
true, but I think he knew which one of those was going to be the soundbite, and he knew he was trying to rile up people's anger and he, for all the talk about wanting to avoid class warfare, anger against the poor is something that has often been acceptable. You think of Reagan talking about welfare queens. This, to me, was not much different. And it's just kind of unfortunate in that, it's not that I miss the policies of George W. Bush, and I don't even really care about the word compassionate. What I liked was the difference in demanding that we have a conversation that at least acknowledges that we all want to help the poor, which I don't think is the case right now.
Well, if I can just say, too, this reminds me of what was so annoying about Mitt Romney's line last week about not caring about poor people. Mm-hmm. And I am totally willing to concede that he was completely taken out of context, and it was like, sure, it was insane and stupid for him to ever let those words come out of his mouth, but he was sort of quoted out of context. He wasn't saying he didn't care about poor people. He was talking about how most of his campaign is focused on the 95% of the middle, right? Not the very wealthy, not the very poor. But what really bothered me about what he said was that, like, if there's a problem with the
safety net,
the welfare net, then we'll fix it. It's like, if there's a problem, we clearly have a problem. Like, clearly these programs have not been that great. Right. They have not served their purpose. And if he were a conservative running, he would know why they haven't worked, why the incentive structure is flawed, and how to change them. Anyway, he was not wrong. He was not so wrong in the way that people were taking him out of context, but I thought he was very wrong if you took him in context too. But anyway. So I wonder, did you catch the National Prayer Breakfast at all?
I am ashamed to admit that I did not at all, again, because of the sick child.
Well, I went last year. It was the only time I'd ever gone, which I write a lot about civil religion. I'm a critic of sort of the blending of religion and politics, so it's finally got in, and I got to see it in action. Mm-hmm. And for a Lutheran like myself, it was just as horrifying as you might imagine. Although, last year, I was completely impressed with what President Obama had to say. He gave a very clear confession of Christian faith. And I actually wrote at the time... It was the most personal
religious statement I think I've heard any president give.
It was, and therefore... Well, and I was, because it didn't blend religion and politics or so much, I was able to really sort of agree with it. Mm-hmm. It sounded similar to what you might hear in my church even. And there was commentary among some of my fellow co-religionists about that. Mm-hmm. This year it was wildly different. I didn't go, but I watched. And President Obama talked about how his religious faith informs his policy decisions. Mm-hmm. And once again, actually, there wasn't terribly much coverage of it, although a little bit more. But did you catch what he said there at all about how how his positions on marginal tax rates is informed by the Gospels.
Yeah, and I am always very suspicious when people take kind of broader religious teachings and are able to somehow come up with a specific policy idea that seems to stream straight from it. I think you need to be specific or suspicious once people start getting specific about stuff like that. And in fact, it brought to mind, I believe it was the week before the last Republican debate, where all of the candidates were asked how their religious faith would inform their work as president. And I was so glad that they asked Ron Paul first.
I know.
Because his answer kind of threw down the gauntlet for everybody else, and I think kind of muted their responses. And he just came out and said, it doesn't. It shapes my character. It shapes
he said it shapes me as a person, yes. But the Constitution is what would govern me as president. I love
exactly. And I wished that Obama had been thinking about that. Although, the one thing I wished Paul had in his answer is an acknowledgement that, of course, it's very difficult for people to separate their religious selves from the rest of themselves. It may be impossible, in fact. And so, of course, it will end up influencing how you think about some things. But, the ideal for him as a politician should be that he is, informed by the Constitution.
Well, I think if there's one benefit to it, I think there is a truth that for a lot of Christians and people of other religions as well, faith does affect the way that policy is drafted. And you frequently hear it criticized when it happens on the right. But it does also happen on the left, too. And I think there have been some media blinders about how that works. I mean, I happen to be critical of it in either direction, but it's unfair to just pinpoint it when it happens on the right.
Absolutely.
But
Well, I was just going to say that that's one of the things I bring up with a lot of liberals when they disagree with Republicans citing religion for their stance on, opposing gay marriage or opposing abortion. It's, what did you think about civil rights? And those who, supported civil rights because of their religious beliefs. Like, it goes both ways, and you can't pick and choose there. So we need to be very careful when we bring religion in. And I just thought it was done in a very amateurish way in Obama's speech, and unusual for him, because if you look back at his call to renewal speech in 2006, it was just a much more intelligent blending of religion and political belief or policies. And I worry that he himself, I think, can be very smart on this stuff and very thoughtful, but he's president. He doesn't have time to do this anymore. He wrote that 2006 speech himself. This came out of the speechwriting shop. It was obviously a political attempt to push back against people who insist that only religious beliefs only inform conservative political positions. But I didn't think that it accomplished what they thought it should.
Yeah, it was short-sighted, I think. If Jesus is telling you to have a certain economic policy, why is he not telling you to let Catholics abide by their own conscience, or any number of other issues that might even be clearer in the scripture or whatnot? There was also another interesting speech at the prayer breakfast, which I watched after it was delivered, by Eric Metaxas, who is an author. He wrote a book on William Wilberforce, who was the champion in ending slavery in England.
And he also Bonhoeffer.
Yeah. And so he's a very good keynote speaker. I've heard him before at an event. He's very funny, he's very smart, very winsome. But he did a rather surprising thing. It actually made me nervous to watch it. He actually, he talks about how Wilberforce was fighting during an era when Africans were considered less than fully human, and Bonhoeffer was fighting his battle in an era when Jews were considered less than fully human. And here's Obama sitting not 4 feet from him, and he said something to the effect of, it's worth considering who we currently say is not fully human and what we're doing to fight that battle. It was really amazing to watch, and it was very, very, he huge stones, I think, to bring up that issue in that environment, talk about speaking truth to power. I mean, I understand not everybody agrees that abortion is the taking of a human life or whatnot, but for those who do, it was a very courageous speech to give, and not that you would have read about it in the media coverage of the event. And I did want to say on that point that I think it's unfair. Like, Obama has spoken very clearly about his Christian faith, and it's not reported well. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the media only seem to report it when they're making fun of people for not thinking that he's Christian. But they never report when he talks about being a Christian, right, or when he gives a very clear confession of faith. He said things that are very clear and unambiguous about his personal beliefs about Jesus as his Savior and all these things, and they just don't get covered.
Right. So it's not a surprise that people don't know as much about his faith.
Yeah. Right. And then they get mad at people when they don't know. And it's like, well, part of this is your fault too, media, if you're not reporting what he says. But
yeah. Well, this was just a depressing week all around.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that it's sometimes it's good to have clarifying issues where you remember what's important. And I think if everybody can get unified on why religious freedom is important, even if you don't particularly care about the issue that's being threatened, I think that's a good thing for a society to go through, to remember. And so it's possible that all these things will, you know, for instance, with the HHS ruling, it might work out well. It might be a learning experience for all of us. And that wouldn't be bad to reaffirm the importance of the First Amendment and the free expression clause.
Yeah.
So
if I thought we were about to enter into a high-minded national debate about religious freedom, then I would certainly agree with you. But somehow I don't think we're about to have a year of high-minded political discussion.
Okay, you're depressed.
Only on talking heads.
At least we won't have too many more Republican primary debates, and you know, some of the weariness is going to be behind us, I guess.
Excellent.
Anyway, okay, are we done?
We are. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Great talking to you. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.